Recognizing myself and Ranking Member Deutsch for our opening statements, I will recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute. We will then hear from our witnesses. Without objection, the witnesses' prepared statements will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I'm going to recognize Mr. Cicilline in a minute, and I also would like to note that Mr. Genser will only be able to stay with us till 3:30 or so. He needs to catch a plane to West Africa to see for a meeting, and because of the beautiful weather that we're having, where are you? There you are. He had to rearrange his flight, so we will do our best to get him out of here on time and on the plane. And thank you. Who do we have as our special guest?
Mr. French is here with us.
Mr. French, Mr. Hill, welcome to the committee. Who do you have with you there? Just you, because your interest that you've spoken to me about on your bill on the Christians, Coptic Christians. So thank you, Mr. French Hill. Welcome to our committee, and thank you for your efforts in support of Egypt's Coptic population. And as I will say in my opening remarks, I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of your resolution supporting better treatment and increased protection for the Coptics. And I thank you for being with us today, and we'll recognize you. So let me first turn, if I could, Mr. Deutsch, to Mr. Cicilline, who has to get to another place, and but has an adopted journalist.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Cicilline.
Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Ranking Member Deutsch, for affording me this courtesy. Thank you for convening this hearing on security, human rights, and reform in Egypt. Egypt consistently ranks as one of the worst countries for freedom of the press. Under using counterterrorism laws, President Sisi has censored the press, and journalists are routinely harassed, arrested, and imprisoned without trial. This hearing is timely as this Saturday, a court in Egypt will be deciding whether to execute over 700 individuals who were arrested during the violent dispersal of a protest in 2013. One of these individuals is photojournalist Mohammed Abu Zayed, who is professionally known as Shakan. I was made aware of Shakan's case through the Lantos Commission's Defending Freedoms Project, and I'm so outraged by the conditions surrounding his arrest and detention that I've decided to advocate on his behalf. Shakan is an Egyptian freelance photojournalist whose work has been published in international publications, including the New York Times. On August 14, 2013, while photographing the events occurring in Rabah Square, he was taken into custody along with 2 other journalists. The other journalists, however, were foreign nationals and were released within 2 hours. While Shakan, only 25 at the time, has been abused, beaten, and denied his freedom, due process, and adequate medical treatment ever since, simply because he was doing his job. In 2016, the UN Human Rights Council Working Group on Arbitrary Detention issued a report on his case. It regarded his detention as arbitrary and recommended that he be released immediately. I have sent a letter to President Sisi of Egypt today, urging him to support the immediate release of Shakan, or at the very least, to support an individual trial so that evidence specific to his case can be heard and contested. To paraphrase Shakan, photography is his passion, but he should not have to pay for his passion with his life. Thank you for convening this hearing, and to our witnesses for taking the time to share their knowledge on these very consequential issues. And I really thank the chairman for giving me an opportunity to make those comments.
Of course. Thank you very much, Mr. Cicilline. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. U.S. policy toward Egypt is an issue many of us on this subcommittee, and indeed many of us generally in Congress, have debated over the past few years, but especially since the revolution of 2011. I think many of us recognize the strategic importance of Egypt and the role that it plays in the greater Middle East. And we can all understand the challenges that Egypt has faced since 2011, particularly in respect to security, both national security and economic security. President Sisi has had a very difficult task in implementing some IMF mandated reforms, and we've seen some positive signs as he makes progress, particularly with reductions in food and fuel subsidies. There are signs that economic growth is on pace for its highest since 2008, and Egypt may even have a budget surplus this year. Egypt has begun to commercialize its natural gas resources. Yet, as positive as all those signs are, there's still many questions as to whether the reforms or the level of growth are enough. Egypt is the Middle East's largest country with a rapidly expanding population. The struggles to keep the economy driving while also facing a growing terror threat from ISIS in the Sinai and the Muslim Brotherhood are daunting. But for many of us, while we appreciate the difficult position this puts President Sisi in, we worry that the human rights of Egyptians are being curtailed and that the government's repressive behavior will undermine Egypt's long-term stability. As such good friends, it is important for the United States to let our partners in Egypt know that we're there to support its counterterrorism efforts, but our ideals, our values, our interests will not countenance the erosion of human rights in the name of the fight against terror. After all, the United States has been one of Egypt's largest supporters over the years in terms of economic assistance, in terms of military assistance. In just the past 5 years, the U.S. has provided over $7 billion in bilateral aid to Egypt. And Egypt has been key to holding the line against the Islamic State's Sinai Province affiliate, a U.S. designated foreign terrorist organization. But at what cost? President Sisi launched an offensive earlier this year named Operation Sinai 2018. I'm supportive of the objective, but I'm concerned about the effectiveness of the military's tactics and the lack of transparency in its efforts against ISIS. I'm concerned over allegations that Egypt has used counter-terror operations as a means to crack down on its opposition. The state of emergency laws have been extended, and we've heard reports of the rights of journalists, as Mr. Cicilline just pointed out, activists and critics of the Sisi government. Their rights have been curtailed. One of the most important roles that Congress has is that of oversight over the administration's policies, but also oversight over how the American taxpayer dollars are being spent. So naturally, we want to be cautious. We want to ensure that our assistance is promoting our values and our ideals and long-term stability. We should continue to support Egypt's legitimate operations against the terror groups, but this is by no means a green light to take whatever action the government wants. There must be protections for the citizens of Egypt, and their human rights must be respected. I hope that Egypt, while implementing its economic reforms, will also assess making additional reforms to guarantee the human rights of all of its citizens. That includes revoking the controversial NGO law that President Sisi enacted last year, which is making it difficult for civil society to operate and to promote democratic ideals and democracy programs. It also means ensuring that the rights of ethnic and religious minorities, like the Coptic Christians, which Mr. French Hill is very concerned about, are protected and guaranteed. I have joined Mr. Hill in introducing House Resolution 673, expressing concern about the attacks against Coptic Christians in Egypt, and it's my sincere hope that Egypt protects all of its citizens. I also want to raise the issue of the 20 or so U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents who are currently being detained in Egypt, possibly under dubious causes. I urge Egyptian officials to ensure their rights, their safety, and their well-being are being taken care of, and that their rights are not being violated. In addition to finding a fair and immediate resolution to those cases, I am hopeful for a resolution in the ongoing case against the 43 NGO workers, an issue I've personally been engaged in from day one, and I know that's an issue that many of our colleagues are eager to see resolved. I thank the Egyptian government for working with our State Department officials to try to find a way forward. It is my understanding that we continue to work toward that end to resolve it. But I encourage the Egyptians to resolve this as soon as possible. I encourage the Egyptian government to continue to work with Congress. We can find a way to build this relationship for the betterment of both of our countries. But we have to find a way to do it in a manner that both secures the country and secures the human rights of all of Egypt's citizens. And with that, I'm pleased to turn to Mr. Deutsch, our ranking member.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for calling this hearing. I also want to extend my gratitude to this really terrific panel of experts. Egypt is an important ally for the United States and has been for decades. It is a leader in the Arab world and has been a strong counterterrorism partner to both the United States and Israel. I value the relationship that we share with Egyptians, but I must express my sincere concern about some of the activities and trajectory of the Egyptian government. The state of democratic governance and human rights in Egypt has continued to challenge me. We've watched as civil society and NGOs, including Americans, and dissenting voices are prosecuted and even unlawfully imprisoned. There continue to be reports of torture and other concerning human rights offenses in the country, and the crackdown on journalists and the free press is shocking. Arrests of journalists and increased efforts to control the media and Egyptians' access to social media are an affront to democracy and stand in stark contrast to the democratic change the Tahrir Square Revolution called for. Many of Sisi's actions appear to me as steps toward an authoritative, strongman-led government. Egyptians have striven for and fought for democracy and a return and deserve a move toward freedom and democracy, not a return to totalitarianism. Sisi's recent reelection is further fodder for worry about Egypt's prospects for a thriving democracy. The election was, by all accounts, theatrics, as potential challengers were intimidated and oppressed. There were mass arrests of dissenting voices, and the media limited to only those that issue the state's official message. Women continue to face daily obstacles. Cairo has been listed among the most dangerous large cities for women. Assaults, harassment, verbal abuse, and fear are commonplace for Egyptian women. And while we've observed some progress, like Egypt banning the practice of female genital mutilation, girls continue to be cut in secret. Furthermore, Egypt's discrimination against the LGBTQ community, often arrested under claims of membership in groups aiming to overthrow the government, is again a key concern for Egypt's overall trajectory. We've seen some indication Egypt's economy is making gradual improvements, but the country continues to lag behind in extending economic growth to rural and impoverished regions. Economic reform and improved economic opportunity will be key to Egypt's future. In the realm of terrorism, Egypt has been a dedicated fighting force against ISIS cells throughout the country, particularly in the Sinai. ISIS is still a global terror group, and its loss of territory in Iraq and Syria does not mean that the group has been defeated. Egypt's dedication to fighting this dangerous terrorist group reflects common ground with the United States, and we are most grateful for that. With that in mind, we as Congress must still emphasize the need for human rights while embarking upon a comprehensive, coordinated counterterrorism and counterinsurgency strategy. The press needs to be free to report factual news, and Egypt cannot implement domestic political policies under the guise of security. I've said this at every hearing that we have had on Egypt since the revolutions that took down Mubarak. It doesn't matter who sits in the government. Our message and respect for human rights must remain the same. While the United States desperately wants to see Egypt's security and economy sectors be strengthened and bolstered, we cannot ignore the suffering of people and the challenge to democracy just to focus on economic and security assistance. I want to see a stable Egypt, one that continues decades of partnership with the United States, but there must be security and human rights improvements as well. Human rights are vital to the growth of a healthy democracy, and these issues cannot be put on the back burner under the guise of focusing first on the economy or other factors. I look forward to the conversation today, and I again want to thank all of our witnesses for being here, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mr. Deutsch. And now we'll turn to members for their statements. Mr. Donovan, Ambassador Wagner, and Mr. Hill.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Deutsch, for conducting this important hearing today on Egypt, security, human rights, and reform. In the past, the United States and Egypt have enjoyed a friendship and partnership, but Egypt's drift towards China, Russia, and most especially North Korea raises grave concerns. As we all know, 2 years ago, U.S. intelligence tracked a North Korean ship that was headed towards Egypt. U.S. officials warned Egyptian officials, and an Egyptian naval vessel ordered the crew to halt for an inspection. In addition to the cargo listed on the ship's manifest, there were also over 2,400 North Korean rocket-propelled grenades and completed components for 6,000 more. As the United Nations report concluded, this was the, quote, largest seizure of ammunition in the history of sanctions against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, end quote. The evidence against Egypt was clear. For example, each crate had been stenciled with the name of an Egyptian company. Many of the rounds were practice rounds, demonstrating that they were intended for training for a sizable army. There is no doubt the shipment of North Korean weapons was intended for the Egyptian military. While the United States has cited this incident as a reason for delaying $300 million in aid, I am looking forward to hearing what more we can do to dissuade the Egyptians from violating international law and partnering with North Korea. We are happy to work with Egypt and honor our historic relationship, but Egypt must do its part as well. And with that, Madam Chairwoman, I waive the remainder of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Donovan. Ambassador Wagner.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for hosting this hearing. And thanks to our witnesses for your expertise. Egypt has been a valuable partner in managing Israeli-Palestinian tensions, countering terrorism, and supporting U.S. military operations in the region. But despite receiving significant support from the United States, Egypt remains a problematic partner due to its serious human rights abuses, especially persecution faced by Coptic Christians. Egypt's historical importance to our regional policy goals shouldn't give it a free pass. Our close relationship means we have an opportunity to help Egypt achieve real progress in safeguarding human rights and advancing democratic reforms. The United States must continue to hold Egypt to a high standard. I thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. Mr. Issa of California.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And on a slightly different note, unequivocally, we need Egypt as much or more than Egypt needs us. Our relationship with Egypt has been strained, but it was strained in no small part because the Obama administration allowed the Muslim Brotherhood to take over, run the country, persecute Christians in a way that no Coptic Christian I know had ever seen. Since the takeover of the new regime, we have shown indifference to them. We have gone out of our way to withhold funds, so much so that they have, in fact, and I regret that they have made this decision, I think it's a bad decision, looked elsewhere at times for military weapons. The bottom line is that the only safe border that Egypt has is the one with Israel, and even that border takes divisions to guard against operatives, ISIS in the Sinai. So I will say to my colleagues, yes, I would like to see better human rights, but ask a Coptic Christian which they'd rather have, the last regime that my previous president endorsed, or the regime today that's fighting ISIS and other enemies on all its borders while defending Israel's border so that it need not worry nearly the way it had in the past. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Issa. And to talk about the Coptic Christians, Mr. Hill is recognized. Welcome to our subcommittee.
I thank you, my friend from Florida, the chairwoman and the ranking member, for the opportunity to speak today. I'm proud to be a sponsor of House Resolution 673, which expresses concerns over attacks on Coptic Christians in Egypt. While I give full credit to President el-Sisi for his work to promote religious tolerance and support for Egyptian Copts, I believe there's much more that can be done to ensure that the president's message trickles down and is implemented by his government's educational, cultural, and provincial officials. On the heels of the recent Department of State report, I look forward to hearing today from witnesses on the ways that Egypt can improve in this area. I thank the chairwoman and Mr. Cicilline for their friendship and their work and original co-sponsor on this resolution. And I thank the 5 other members of this subcommittee and 14 members of the full committee that co-sponsor this message of appreciation for efforts made and call for continued progress. And with that, Madam Chair, I thank you and I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hill. And now would like to introduce and recognize to speak first, Mr. Jared Genzer. I hope that you make your flight. Managing Director of the Perseus Strategies and Adjunct Professor of Law at Georgetown University Law Center. Mr. Genzer is known for his work freeing political prisoners and is a recipient of the American Bar Association's International Human Rights Award. Thank you for being here today, and we will recognize you first off.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member Deutsch, and distinguished members of the committee. It's great to be with you all this afternoon. First, I'll discuss my perspective on the situation of human rights in Egypt. Second, I'll talk about some of the important issues between Egypt and the United States in the bilateral relationship. And then lastly, I'll provide my recommendations about how I believe the U.S. should use its leverage from our annual appropriations to Egypt to secure important reforms. For the sake of time, let me just summarize first the situation of human rights in Egypt, which I have expounded more upon in my written testimony, because the situation, I think, is well known to all of you. Under President Sisi, crackdowns on freedom of speech, expression, assembly, and religion are commonplace. Today, there are tens of thousands of political prisoners. Police forces employ arbitrary arrests, extrajudicial execution, and enforced disappearances to punish dissent, not only of political opponents, lawyers, NGO workers, but also journalists and bloggers as well. Travel bans and asset freezes are deployed against human rights defenders, and national security officers routinely torture political detainees with techniques that include beatings, electric shocks, stress positions, and sometimes even rape. And of course, we've already heard mentioned from all of you this afternoon, the situation of the Coptic Christian community, which continues to face serious repression and persecution, as well as the GLBT community in Egypt as well. While the Egyptian people have faced the brunt of the abuses under Sisi's authoritarian rule, there are three especially important human rights concerns directly connected to the United States that Sisi has inexplicably allowed to fester, despite the U.S. having provided more than $76 billion of foreign assistance since 1948 and $1.3 billion annually in military assistance alone in recent years. First, some 5 years after the felony convictions of the 43 Egyptian and foreign NGO workers, 17 of whom were Americans, the affair has remained an unfortunate irritant in U.S.-Egypt relations. It appears Cairo and Washington are close to a resolution of the case, and I can only hope for all those impacted that we see a fair and expedient resolution. I know both the U.S. and Egypt have remained actively engaged in discussing this issue, and I believe if it were to get a fair resolution, it could be an important measure that shows Egypt's willingness to improve our bilateral relations, and in a small part, its human rights record. Although I would note, of course, that the NGO law that President Sisi promised not to sign after visiting the Congress and with the president here in Washington, he did in fact sign. And despite promises now that it's not going to be enforced, in fact, we've already seen enforcement well underway, as I know some of the other panelists will discuss. Second, the government of Egypt continues to wrongly imprison close to 20 American citizens and legal permanent residents. This includes Mustafa Qassem, an American auto parts dealer caught up in the crackdown in Rabah Square. And it includes two clients of mine, Ola Al-Karadari and Hussam Khalaf, a married couple who were approved for green cards during the Trump administration and have 8 American citizen family members. In the last month, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights called for Ola and Hussam's immediate release, and the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention found that they were being held arbitrarily and in violation of international law. Both have been held incommunicado in terrible conditions and without regular access to counsel or any access to family for more than a year. Ola is the longest held female political prisoner in solitary confinement by the Egyptian regime, and she's been on a hunger strike demanding her most basic human rights and her immediate release. And while the Trump administration did secure the release of 2 Americans, Aya Hijazi and Ahmed Atiwi, more hostages have been taken by this purported ally of the United States. Finally, there's the case of April Corley, a U.S. citizen who is also a client of mine and who was seriously injured in Egypt's western desert in an attack by the Egyptian military using a U.S.-funded and supplied Boeing AH-64 Apache helicopter in September 2015. April is now permanently disabled, unable to work, and in constant pain. Yet while the government of Egypt has expressed its remorse, it has offered less money as a settlement than the cost of the medevac out of Egypt, which she had to pay for herself. Sisi has so far rightly concluded that U.S. military assistance comes with a license to kill or injure Americans with total impunity, because he actually has the full protection of our legal system to do so. April, in fact, cannot even sue Egypt for her injuries because of the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. And inexplicably, neither President Trump nor President Obama, nor the U.S. Congress, has imposed any consequence on Egypt for refusing to fairly resolve April's case or secure a final resolution of the case, despite the fact that it was U.S.-funded equipment that she as a taxpayer paid for that led to her plight. Lastly, let me talk about my recommendations about how to improve Egypt's human rights record. As a human rights lawyer, I'm often asked to comment on the most effective ways to improve the compliance of governments with their binding obligations under human rights treaties to which they are a party. That is indeed generally an enormous challenge. But in the case of the bilateral relationship between the United States and Egypt, our government has enormous leverage. Contrary to the view of the government of Egypt, which sees our foreign assistance as an entitlement and not as a privilege, the United States has no legal obligation to provide assistance to Egypt. While it is in our regional strategic interest to support Egypt in its fight against Islamic extremism and terrorism, today it is a less important and less effective ally, as it has both at times aligned itself with Russia and North Korea, and its own capabilities to support our objectives have been degraded from within. It is equally a major error in judgment for the United States to ignore the way that Sisi is governing, which works directly in contravention of that goal. Indeed, our country knows from experience that radicalization occurs in environments in which an authoritarian ruler suppresses the population's democratic aspirations for self-government, seriously represses its rights, and poorly manages an economy that has a lack of good-paying jobs, especially for young people. All of these elements exist in Sisi's Egypt today. Surely Egypt can find a way to address its legitimate security concerns while ensuring both the rule of law and human rights are respected. Indeed, this is in the interest of both the US and Egypt, as its stability and leadership is important for a secure and stable Middle East. Yet right now, unfortunately, it's business as usual here in Washington, with Egypt's aid flowing basically unimpeded. This not only sends the wrong message to Cairo, but it puts our regional strategic interest at great risk in both the medium and longer term. The smartest way forward for the United States is for President Trump and Secretary Pompeo, as well as the US Congress, to send a clear and consistent message to Sisi that while the United States views Egypt as an important ally, the American people expect our allies to act in certain ways. First, the United States must say that Egypt's actions targeting American citizens and legal permanent residents must stop. For President Trump, who has spoken of America first, this motto is empty rhetoric if he tolerates any of this behavior by the Sisi government. The president should tell Sisi privately, as a start, that if he doesn't permanently resolve the NGO cases, pardon the wrongly imprisoned Americans and LPRs, and pay appropriate compensation to April Corley, all three of which Sisi can do today within his powers as president, then President Trump will have no choice but to make serious cuts in Egypt's aid. It is particularly worrying that the administration may waive the human rights conditions on and release the $195 million of FY17 funds that have been held back, which will undoubtedly be taken by Sisi as a clean bill of health on human rights. Second, the US Congress needs to speak in one voice about the path that Sisi has taken as being unacceptable. While the FY19 Foreign Operations Appropriations Bill in the Senate imposes human rights conditions on 30% of Egypt's proposed $1 billion in reduced military assistance, the House bill maintains $1.3 billion in military assistance and imposes no conditions of any kind. As authorizers, you have the ability to advocate with your colleagues and ultimately help ensure that the final bill that will come out from the conference committee and will go to the floor of the House and the Senate imposes the human rights conditions from the Senate version of the bill. If those human rights conditions are dropped, the message sent to Sisi would be unmistakable, that the United States will ignore his abuse of numerous Americans, his evisceration of Egypt's democracy, and the egregious abuses that he has imposed on his own population, all in the name of a so-called greater good. Finally, we need transparency and visibility here in Washington, not only about the US-Egypt relationship, but the way in which the Sisi government treats its own people. This hearing is an important start. Nonetheless, I can't remember the last time I saw any administration official, from the Trump administration or Obama administration before it, actually testify before the US Congress about the realities of the US-Egypt relationship. And it is important for the Congress to hear directly from victims of the Sisi government, both American and Egyptian. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today, and I'm happy also to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gensler. We appreciate you being here. And thank you to our panelists for extending that courtesy to him. We're delighted to welcome back Mr. Samuel Tadros, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute Center for Religious Freedom. Mr. Tadros is also a professional lecturer at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies and a distinguished visiting fellow of Middle Eastern Studies at Hoover Institution. Thank you for being here again. I still can't say your name right. We look forward to your testimony. And next, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Michelle Dunn, Director and Senior Fellow of the Middle East Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Prior to this post, Dr. Dunn served in the U.S. missions in Cairo and Jerusalem, as well as at the National Security Council. Thank you for your service. We look forward to your testimony, Doctor. And finally, we're delighted to welcome Mr. Andrew Miller, Deputy Director for Policy at the Project on the Middle East and Democracy, and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Previously, Mr. Miller served at the U.S. Department of State and the National Security Council. Thank you for your service. We welcome your testimony as well. And we will begin with you, Sam.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Ranking Member Deutsch, distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for holding this hearing and for inviting me to testify today. I have submitted the written testament with the detailed description of the challenges facing Egypt and recommendations for U.S. policy. But let me devote those few minutes to discussing the Egypt-American relationship in general. For the previous 4 decades, the U.S.-Egypt alliance has been a cornerstone of the American order in the Middle East. After 2 decades of tensions and conflict between both countries, Secretary Kissinger and President Sadat forged a new basis for the American-Egyptian relationship, helping attain key U.S. objectives during the Cold War. In return for U.S. aid to Egypt, successive administrations hoped that the country that led the region to war and destruction would now lead it to peace and cooperation. Despite this, the relationship between the 2 countries has never been a smooth one. Egypt was always a problematic ally. From Egypt's conduct during the Achille Lauro affair, an attempt to smuggle missile components under President Reagan, from its attempt to stop economic cooperation between Arab countries and Israel, and its pressure on Yasser Arafat not to give any concessions during the Camp David summit under President Clinton, to the Mubarak regime's refusal to reform under President Bush's tenure. Throughout those 3 decades, there were deep U.S.-Egyptian disagreements over a variety of issues, ranging from the peace process, U.S. policies in the region, democracy, and human rights. Moreover, despite continued U.S. economic and military assistance to Egypt, the Egyptian press, allowed to by the government, controlled by the government, continued to traffic in anti-American and anti-Semitic arguments. And yet, these previous disagreements and frustrations pale in comparison with the tension, disappointment, and mistrust that has shaped the previous decade in U.S.-Egyptian relations. Policies followed by the Obama administration, perceived in Egypt as ones that in support of the Muslim Brotherhood, the condemnation of the military coup, and threats to cut U.S. military aid to the country have led to growing antagonism in Cairo. In turn, Egypt has shown an unwillingness to cooperate on regional security challenges, such as joining the fight against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, pursued an independent policy in Libya, deepened its military and economic ties to the Russian Federation, pursued a scorched earth strategy to wipe out the Islamic State's affiliate in Sinai, cracked down on all forms of dissent in the country, stifling civil society and any independent media, engaged in appalling human rights abuses, continued to attempt to undercut U.S. resolutions in the United Nations, and most importantly, engaged in an unprecedented wave of anti-American propaganda and conspiracy theories at home. The American-Egyptian alliance is crumbling. For some in Washington, while unfortunate, an end to the alliance is inevitable. Cold War rationale should no longer be the basis of a continued alliance with a problematic partner, and the 2 countries do not see eye to eye on many important issues. Moreover, Egypt's regional importance has vastly diminished. Egypt has continued to decline on all levels, economically, culturally, and politically. It is no longer today the key player in the Middle East that it was in the past. As an external power, Egypt is a shadow of its former self, and there are well-founded doubts about its capacity to play a leading and constructive role, even if it wanted to. Instead, Egypt itself has increasingly become a locus of the region's unfolding strategic competition, an unprecedented political and ideological crisis of the state-based order. The regional decline is a reflection of deeper ills within Egypt itself. The inability of the country's leadership to reform the economy through market-oriented policies, combating corruption and addressing the dysfunctional bureaucracy, has worsened the lives of millions of Egyptians. I'd continue with all the failures of the government. I hope that the US is able to develop a coherent strategy to deal with these challenges.
Thank you
and
so
happy to
much,
address the
Mr. Tadros. Did I get it? All right, Dr. Dunn. Nate corrected me. Take no
Chairman
credit.
Ross-Leighton and Ranking Member Deutsch and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify. I'm going to focus in my brief remarks here on developments in Egypt's political scene that have implications for the country's stability as well as for U.S. interests. With your permission, I've submitted a slightly longer written statement.
Without objection.
Thank you. During the first half of 2018, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi eliminated 5 presidential challengers, 4 of them senior and well-known figures, through arrest or intimidation. Sisi was then re-elected after running against a virtual unknown. One of the would-be candidates, former Army Chief of Staff Sami Anan, suffered a stroke in prison and is now in critical condition. There's been also a recent wave of arrests of those who have criticized Sisi publicly. Again, some of these are quite well-known people. Abdelmonem Abdel Fattah, the founder of the Strong Egypt Party, himself a previous presidential candidate, blogger Wael Abbas, youth activist Shadi al-Ghazali Harb, human rights defender Amal Fati, as well as others. They've joined tens of thousands of other political prisoners who have been detained for months, in some cases years, and often in harsh conditions, including prolonged solitary confinement and denial of adequate medical care, in addition to the even harsher measures that Mr. Genser discussed, torture and so forth. So why all these arrests now? Well, they come amid signs that President Sisi might try to stay in office beyond the end of his second term. The 2014 Egyptian constitution, which was written after the 2013 military coup, but before Sisi became president, stipulated that the president is limited to 2 4-year terms. And of course, the writers of the Constitution wrote that because President Mubarak stayed in office for 30 years. During his first term, Sisi promised that he would leave office after 8 years, but he has not repeated that pledge, either during his re-election campaign or since beginning his second term. His supporters are now saying that 8 years are not enough, and it's widely reported that amendments to the Constitution will be introduced into the parliament to remove term limits and perhaps extend the presidential term from 4 to 6 years, as well as make other changes to strengthen presidential powers. President Sisi has also taken steps that appear designed to ensure the loyalty of senior military officers to him personally. He has recently replaced the ministers of defense and interior, the head of general intelligence, the Army Chief of Staff. And the parliament recently passed a law that would grant designated security officers lifelong immunity for crimes committed following the 2013 coup. For example, the mass killings at Rabaa and other acts of violence. This law gives the president the right to designate which senior officers would enjoy such immunity, and thus will be a highly effective tool in the hands of President Sisi to ensure loyalty to him. Now, why should the United States care if Sisi paves the way to remaining president for life? First of all, if he succeeds, at best, the lack of new blood in political leadership would bring back the stagnation, corruption, and lack of responsiveness to citizens, lack of accountability that led to the revolt against Mubarak, but with much more brutal repression in the case of the Sisi regime. That's a recipe for trouble in this nation of 100 million people and neighbor to Israel. And if Sisi tries to secure a lock on the presidency and he fails, but there are no credible political processes to sort things out, then the country might well be headed for violent unrest before too long. While the United States cannot and should not try to micromanage Egypt's politics, the U.S. government, and particularly the Congress, can scrutinize engagement with Egypt and aid to Egypt to be sure that the United States is promoting stability for the entire nation rather than repression and one-man rule. My specific recommendations include keep conditions on security assistance. They're working. The U.S. administration has become bolder in using the human rights conditions that Congress has written into legislation and has withheld assistance based on some of the concerns that Mr. Genser articulated, the conviction of NGO workers in 2013, the draconian new NGO law that would crush civil society, and Egypt's dealing with North Korea. These problems have not yet been resolved. There are signs, though, of greater responsiveness on the part of the Egyptian government since the suspension of aid. So keep writing those conditions into legislation and encourage the administration to use them, which of course means not releasing aid until the benchmarks are met. I would recommend a bottom-up review of security assistance to be right-sized to make sure that it meets Egypt's actual defense needs rather than the military's desire for impressive weapons systems. Insist on vigorous implementation of end-use monitoring to ensure that equipment provided is not used for human rights abuses because, as we've already heard, it has been. Consider shifting some assistance from security to address some of the urgent needs of the population, such as modernization of the country's water infrastructure. It is headed for a water crisis. Ultimately, it's for Egyptian citizens to decide the future they want for their country, but it's for American citizens and their representatives to decide how much faith we have in that vision and to what extent we're willing to support it.
Thank you,
very
Dr.
much.
Dunn, very much. Mr. Miller.
Chairman Ross Leighton, Ranking Member Deutsch, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify. With your permission, I will summarize my written testimony, which I've submitted for the record. I will describe 3 defining and concerning characteristics of Egypt under President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. Then I will offer 2 recommendations regarding security assistance that can help advance U.S. interest while right-sizing the bilateral relationship. The first key characteristic of Egypt today is that the country is no longer as important to U.S. interests as it once was, due both to its own internal decline and the growing influence of wealthy Gulf states. Egypt has ceased to be a regional power. Egypt still matters to the U.S., but more because we cannot afford the Arab world's most populous country becoming a basket case that generates refugee flows or terrorist threats abroad. A second characteristic is how poorly Sisi's military-backed government is managing these problems. Dr. Dunn already addressed the dangers of Sisi's attempt to create a total autocracy in Egypt. In the security arena, too, Sisi has been unable to defeat ISIS-Sinai and other terrorist groups. In fact, 2017 saw the most fatalities from terrorist attacks in modern Egyptian history, 756, while the mass incarceration of peaceful citizens is worsening the radicalization problem. On the economic front, Sisi has made some important fiscal reforms, but his policies have led to deteriorating living standards, threatening the country's stability. Third, Egypt is a very difficult partner for the United States. Despite the $1.3 billion in FMF funds we provide each year, Sisi has continued to cooperate with North Korea and imprisoned U.S. citizens on trumped-up charges. Even where we share common interests, Egypt has often rejected cooperation. For example, Egypt has spurned U.S. offers to train its military in the modern counterterrorism tactics essential to defeating groups like ISIS. It is becoming harder to argue that the U.S. is getting a good return on its investment in Egypt. What can the U.S. do to break out of this unsatisfactory cycle? There are 2 steps that Congress could take that would advance the vital U.S. interest in Egypt's long-term stability while ensuring a better return on investment. For Washington to send a clear message, U.S. military aid, which the Egyptian leadership values greatly, will have to be put on or off the table. First, Congress should keep human rights conditions on military assistance in the FY19 appropriations bill. The Trump administration made use of this conditionality last August when it suspended $195 million in FMF funding, in part over human rights concerns. As a result, after years of stalling, Egypt finally arranged for a retrial in an infamous 2013 case in which 17 Americans received prison sentences on outrageous political charges. Egypt also reportedly forced North Korea to reduce the size of its embassy in Cairo, Pyongyang's largest in the region. While neither step merits releasing the $195 million, they suggest that U.S. pressure is indeed having some effect. In FY19, Congress should continue such conditionality and seek an end to Sisi's crackdown in civil society, the release of political prisoners, and access for U.S. military officials to the Sinai for end-use monitoring. These steps would both open up the political space that is so important to Egypt's long-term stability and show that Sisi is willing to address legitimate U.S. concerns. My second recommendation is that Congress should reduce military assistance to $1 billion, as proposed in the Senate Appropriations Committee markup. Egypt views U.S. military aid as an entitlement and expects that the U.S. will ultimately back down from any threat or attempt to use it as leverage. This perception undermines U.S. influence. Consequently, reducing Egypt's military aid would send an unmistakable signal that we expect more in return for our support. The risks of imposing human rights conditionality and reducing military aid are often exaggerated. The Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty is no longer dependent on U.S. aid or mediation. Egypt will not abandon the U.S. in favor of Russia or China, and cutting this aid will not degrade the capabilities of an Egyptian military that needs better training, not more weapons. If these steps are taken, the U.S. will be in a stronger position to persuade Sisi's government to open up political space, reform Egypt's military doctrine, and address radicalization. At the very least, cutting Egypt's military aid will be a service to the American taxpayer who has seen little return on their investment in the present Egyptian government. In closing, the U.S.-Egyptian relationship is no longer working. I hope Congress will take this chance to recalibrate it for a new era. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Excellent recommendations from all of you. Mr. Genzer, you've represented some of the most well-known human rights activists and political prisoners in recent years, securing their freedom, their release from a wide variety of countries. Please compare the case of your clients in Egypt to those in other countries. And are there certain aspects of Egypt's legal system and approach to human rights that stand out? And what are the specific challenges that the accused face in Egypt?
Well, thank you, Chairwoman Ross-Lehtinen. You've been an extraordinary partner for so many victims of human rights abuses around the world, and especially in support of families of political prisoners. And it's going to be very sad to see you depart the Congress at the end of this term. We'll all miss you. So with respect to the situation in Egypt and political prisoners, I think it's unmistakable that when you have tens of thousands of people detained at any one time, the reality is that most of them are being detained not even on trumped-up charges, but on no charges at all. And you can't have due process of law when you have tens of thousands of people being detained at once, let alone probable cause for arresting these kinds of people. What my clients, Ola Al-Qaradari and Hossam Khalaf, have suffered, these US LPRs, is emblematic of the problem. You know, they were accused in the media of being associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, although they were, of course, cleared by President Trump for their green cards. So I would not find that to be a very credible accusation. And they've been held on renewable detention orders for a year and counting. Brought before judges that, you know, first heard 15-day renewals. Now it's every 45 days they appear. They have had no access to their family for more than a year. Neither of them have been able to have access to their families. And even when they're brought to court, they aren't even able to access their counsel. They're in a glass aquarium all the way across the courtroom and unable to even talk to their own lawyers. And Egypt has presented no evidence of any kind that they have committed any crimes, let alone that they would be prosecuted for them. And they are in this permanent state of renewable detention. This is a phenomenon we see widely across Egypt, not just against U.S. legal permanent residents or American citizens, but against ordinary Egyptians and real or imagined political opponents of the regime. You also have, of course, the reinstitution of the emergency law, which now has provided these alternate courts that don't have basic due process protections and no right of appeal. And this is obviously a very, very dangerous trend where in the name of counterterrorism operations, people are being sent to these kinds of court systems that have built-in endemic and systematic problems. And ultimately, the judiciary in Egypt, of course, is not independent or impartial as well. So I think that this would The situation in Egypt is very analogous to the kind of situations that I have worked with around the world in lots of different authoritarian contexts, whether it be, an Iran or a Cuba or Venezuela, or any one of a number of African countries that I've worked in, the Gambia, you name it. I mean, I think the reality is that this is an authoritarian ruler in President Sisi who is determined to have his way, not only electorally, but in terms of ensuring that there is no legitimate peaceful dissent that has any power of any kind to be able to challenge his rule. And I think that we see that playing out in the form of the number of political prisoners. I think that in any country around the world where you see political prisoners, that should be for everybody around the world a sign that this is a country that is moving in the wrong direction rather than the right direction. And Egypt having tens of thousands or more political prisoners, not even all of whom have been documented, and the way that they're treated in prison is very emblematic of the repression of the Sisi regime.
Thank you very much, Mr. Genzer. Thank you for your defense of political dissidents, and we wish you much success in your human rights work. Thank you very much. I will ask Mr. Donovan to take over for me if he could while I have some constituent appointments in the side room. And with that, I'm pleased to yield to the ranking member, my good friend, Mr. Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Egypt has seen a multitude of changes since 2011's uprising that led to revolution. But looking at Egypt in its current state, I think the message that a lot of us have here is our concern about democracy. And the recent Egyptian election indicators that they weren't free and fair. Minorities and opposing voices are being repressed, and Egypt's press and media are more and more restricted. Mr. Miller, you propose retaining human rights conditions on our assistance. We've had those conditions now in place over the past several years. To what extent have they worked, or what more can be done to ensure that they do?
Thank you, Congressman. I think that they have, as I mentioned in my testimony, produced some results. We have seen that there's finally movement in the 2013 NGO trial, in which 17 Americans, 43 defendants overall, were charged in up to 5 years of jail. We've also seen, according to the Egyptians, that they forced the North Koreans to reduce the size of their presence within Pyongyang. In prior years, conditionality played an important role in getting the release of political prisoners, Aya Higazi, Mohammed Sultan, other figures. It does produce results. Now, they may seem small bore, but I think there's a reason for that. Part of the challenge is pressure only works if the other side believes that you're going to stick by it, that you're going to adhere to the conditions you laid out. And unfortunately, over the past 40 years, the U.S. has tended to capitulate after applying pressure to the Egyptians. And that's part of why I think coupling the conditionality with a reduction in assistance overall to send the message that the $1.3 billion isn't sacrosanct, that it's not simply enough to fulfill these conditions, but we want a genuinely different approach, will translate into better results. There really hasn't been a good test of conditionality, partly because we haven't stuck firm. If we stick firm in the future, I'm fairly confident that we're going to get better results as well.
Thank you, Dr. Dunn. So other than reducing the amount of assistance, what's the best way to message, the most effective way to message on human rights to the Sisi government? And has the administration done it? What more can the administration do to send that very clear message?
Thank you, Congressman. Well, two things. I would say what the current administration has done that I think is effective is establish some specific benchmarks. It seems to be that when they withheld the $195 million last summer, they established some specific benchmarks that they were looking for. And that is, I think the Obama administration didn't do that as clearly. They withheld some assistance after the military coup, but it wasn't really clear, and then they ended up releasing it without gaining anything. So that wasn't very effective. What the Obama administration did that I think was, in a way, better, though, was the public messaging. I haven't seen as much. I've seen a little bit. There started to be a little bit of public messaging from the Trump administration about concerns. There was a little bit about the concerns about how the elections were run and so forth. But particularly, I think as we move forward into a situation in which President Sisi, I think, is going to be looking around to see, is it all right with everyone if he stays in office indefinitely and so forth? Is there going to be any reaction to that internationally? There could be, I think, better public messaging and clearer and more consistent private messaging about these issues, as well as conditions on aid. But I mean, just discussing human rights and democracy issues.
Right. So you talked about benchmarks being one way to effectively move the needle on this, but what should that public messaging look like, and who should it be coming from?
The public messaging that is most heard in Egypt, I think, is from either very senior members of the U.S. administration, such as the president and cabinet members, or from members of Congress. Whether they speak here or whether they speak when they visit Egypt and so forth. I mean, it has to be a newsmaker, so to speak, in order to get across, because I think it's very important that not only the Egyptian government hears the message, of course, Egyptian government figures can hear the message privately, but when it's made public, that indicates, to the Egyptian public and so forth, that these issues are being raised with their government. I think it's important to get that across.
Great, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. The chair recognizes himself, since I'm the only one left up here. Let me just ask all of you one question, and maybe everybody could contribute or give me their thoughts. It seems that in order to try to correct bad behavior in the area of human rights, we withhold military aid. The Egyptians probably, I suppose, say then we still have to protect our own nation. We'll have to go elsewhere for that military aid. And where they go? North Korea. So we tell them you can't go to North Korea or we're going to withhold more military aid. So it seems like we're squeezing a balloon a little bit to me. So could you guys give me your opinion on how we could be more successful in this, get them to crack down on the violations on human rights, and at the same time, not let them go to an area where they're violating international laws and going somewhere else for the aid that they need to protect their own nation from their enemies?
Thank you, Congressman. I think that's very much a legitimate concern, and we have to be attentive to the second-order effects of the policy positions that we take. I think it's worth emphasizing, though, that the $1.3 billion Egypt receives is well in excess of what they actually need in order to combat their problems. As I said before, it's really not an equipment problem. I spoke with many U.S. senior military officials, and they told me that the Egyptians are obsessed with magic boxes. They think there's a technological solution to everything that will deal with IEDs, that will deal with insurgents, when in actuality, it's a question of how they use the equipment. And unfortunately, the Egyptians haven't been receptive when the U.S. has offered training in counterterrorism doctrine and tactics. Regarding the assistance level, where they're going to go, what they want from North Korea primarily is missile parts. And the reason they want that is because no one else will sell it to them. If they don't get equipment from the United States, there's equally likely to go to France or the UK, as they are to go to Russia or China. Now, there may be employment consequences for that, and there's a concern about whether we're appropriately subsidizing U.S. defense contractors. But based on my personal experience, if we took the money we took away from Egypt and gave it to another country, they're going to order a lot of the same stuff. So there actually isn't going to be a net impact on how much money is going to subsidize the American arms industry.
Anyone else care to comment? Yes, Doctor.
I think the issue is often framed and discussed in terms of the money itself, and the value of the money has obviously diminished over the years. The 1.3 billion, and it was even much more, 2 billion at the time that the peace treaty with Israel was signed, is obviously not the same as what it buys today. But more important to Egypt is the spare parts, that they need for the weapons that they have been buying for 30, 40 years from the United States, and also the very fact of a relationship with the United States. It matters to be an ally of the world's superpower in terms of prestige in the region, in terms of many things for them, getting economic aid from the World Bank and the IMF. So I think the issue is not just the money there, but there's also a lot of things involved. In terms of actually impacting their policies, I think it depends on how life and death issue the policy is for them. The question of whether how to deal with the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, is viewed by the regime as a life and death issue. They did conduct a military coup. They removed these guys and put them to prison. You don't conduct a coup and then go home and relax. You either rule or you're jailed or die for it. So there are questions that for them, no matter whether it's 1.3 billion, 10 billion, he's not going to put his life in danger for that amount of money. But there are many other issues where we can have a serious discussion with the Egyptian regime on things that don't threaten the regime's continuation. Questions related to media, to bloggers. Dr. Dunn mentioned Wael Abbas, bloggers who are not even a threat to the regime, or not part of any threat that there is for them. The question of the conditions of Christians in the country, and many other issues that you can have an impact and leverage on because they are not life-threatening for them.
Dr. Dunn?
In my experience, Congressman, I don't see President Sisi as resorting to other countries like North Korea or even Russia because the United States has put pressure on him. The Egyptian-North Korean relationship goes very, very far back. And what I have seen is that President Sisi wants to diversify and sort of have all of the above, have all the relationships with all these different players as much as he can. Now, the only question, I think, in terms of the United States is that all right with us? So obviously, it wasn't all right with the United States for Egypt to have the kind of security relationship it has with the United States and also be buying weapons illicitly from North Korea. Another issue that arose recently was the Russian government asked for access to Egyptian air bases. And so that's a question, is that all right for the United States? I think that President Sisi will have as many relationships as he can. And it's not a question of he's taking one because he isn't getting it from someone else. He just wants to diversify his relationships as much as possible. And then we will have to decide if we're going to have a close security relationship, how much of that is okay with us and how much is not.
I thank you all for your comments. The chair now recognizes Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, and again, thank you to the witnesses for joining us today. Normally, I try to go from the general to the specific, but I think I'm going to flip that on its head today and start with the specific, and if there's time, talk more general. But one of my particular concerns is the status of the LGBTQ community in Egypt. And last fall, as you may know, dozens of LGBTQ Egyptians and their allies were arrested and detained after a young Egyptian flew a rainbow flag at a concert in Cairo. And prior to that, there have been other mass arrests dating back all the way to the Queen Boat incident more than 15 years ago. So, Dr. Dunn, I'll start with you, but open the question to anyone, but essentially 3 questions. Any update on the situation for the LGBT community in Egypt, and has the recent crackdown ended, or is it still going? Second question would be, are there ways that the broad international community can have an impact on the environment for the LGBTQ people within Egypt? And the third piece is, I'd love your thoughts on the U.S. government's response to these human rights abuses in Egypt.
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, sadly, I mean, this has been a long-running story in Egypt, targeting harassment of the LGBTQ community, and it has been very much revived in the last couple of years. And unfortunately, it really has happened mostly under military-dominated governments, and so in Egypt specifically. What I have seen, Congressman, is that there are times, and it's hard to explain why the government or actors, security actors within the government will decide to go after, to target, to bait members of this community and to prosecute them, humiliate them publicly, and so forth. What I have seen is that that kind of harassment will tend to abate when there is international attention, and also when Egyptians themselves start speaking up, which happened in a case a couple of years ago where Egyptians themselves started to object. But in the case that you mentioned with the people who were arrested at the concert, I believe that not all of them have been released yet, that some of them have been stuck in detention because there wasn't quite as much attention to that case from the U.S. administration as there had been to some previous cases. There was a bathhouse case, the Queen Boat case you mentioned from many years ago. So it's really important to speak about these things publicly and for Egyptian officials to hear about them from members of Congress as well as the administration.
Thank you. Mr. Tadros, Ms. Miller.
I think there's a reality of the nature of society there. It's a winning social issue for the government. When they engage in such practices, they are intended to shore public support for the government, show that the government is defending values of the Egyptian people, and tie the community and the Western attention to it to Western attempts to weaken Egypt and conspire against it. So I think the regime periodically engages in such practices when it serves the intention of shoring up local support for its policies.
Mr. Miller.
I think this speaks to an important point. There's an assumption that the secular ex-general must be more progressive or more socially tolerant than the former Islamist president. And in reality, President Sisi's policies are often no better and in some cases worse than former President Morsi's on social indicators. LGBTQ rights is one example. Also blasphemy cases. There have been an increase in blasphemy cases under President Sisi as compared to President Morsi, which has a disproportionate impact on Coptic Christians, for instance. While most of the cases involve Muslims, most of the defendants who go to prison are Christians. So in many respects, partly because Sisi is not labeled as an Islamist, he feels freer to cater to the conservative impulses in Egypt that Mr. Tadros mentioned.
Oh, great, thank you. And with the few seconds I have left, the big question, more general, more than half of Egypt's population is under the age of 25. Actually 24. The population is expected to grow to 130 million in the next decade. They're trying to bring that number down. But that demographics has to play into the economic impact, but also broader human rights expectations of both these young people, and it could be a challenge, but could also be an opportunity. So if I can have the indulgence of another minute, I'd love your thoughts on that as well.
Yes, Congressman, this is the mega issue for Egypt, is its rapidly growing and youthful population. Population growth in Egypt had been slowly declining, but now it's turned around and it's been growing rapidly again. The labor force is growing rapidly, and even with an economic growth statistic, GDP growth right now of, I think, 5.4%, that sounds good. To us in the United States, that sounds excellent. But with the population growing, with more than 2 million Egyptians joining the population every year, that doesn't go very far. So, there's a crying need to address the population growth issue itself. Egypt has done some things, but not nearly as much as some others, even others in the Middle East region have done about that. And then there's a great need to generate jobs. And that is another problem of the economic program of President Sisi. While he has instituted important austerity measures, there's been much less in terms of facilitating private sector growth, the growth of small and medium enterprises that really could generate a lot of jobs. It remains an economy, and even increasingly is an economy, in which the playing field is heavily tilted towards the military. in which the military has really been gobbling up a lot of the state contracts and so forth. And therefore, it's a very worrisome issue. Just the last thing I would say is about water. Egypt is going to be, because of its population growth, facing a very serious water shortage within not too many years.
Great. Thank you. I'm out of time. Thanks for the extra time.
Did you want to comment, sir?
Oh, thank you.
If I may, I think the demographic challenge is obviously there. The economic part of it is important, so is the educational part. Egyptian education does not prepare this new generation for the kind of jobs that the new world needs from them. I think there's a need to look into U.S. efforts to support educational reform to Egypt, both in terms of addressing radical ideas that exist in the textbooks and the kind of anti-tolerance messages that are there, as well as looking at the education system as a means to help the country address its problems. The water resource issue is very important as well. The conflict, the growing conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia has the potential of becoming an actual war. And I think it's in the best interest of the United States to deal with this issue before it reaches an explosion point.
I thank you. The chair now recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just before we wrap up, I wanted to ask a couple of questions about the Egyptian military operations, particularly in Sinai. They've sustained significant losses. Can someone speak to U.S. counterterrorism support for the Egyptian forces? Mr. Miller, can you speak to that?
I would be happy to, Congressman. There is ongoing support, and it's largely of two dimensions. One is intelligence support. We provide them with information on the location and identity of extremists who are operating the Sinai, and that helps them to intercept them. But the major problem, as I said before, was the training dimension. Egypt employs a conventional, obsolete approach to conventional threats that isn't appropriate to dealing with insurgents, that isn't appropriate to dealing with terrorists. And repeatedly, the United States, going back to the late Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, has tried to have this conversation with the Egyptian military, the need to reform how they approach these threats, to focus on building allegiances with local populations, understanding that the intelligence they provide is the key to success, and paying attention to how they're impacted by what's taking place. The impact has been tremendous. You have 3,000 additional homes destroyed during just this operation. You have over 3,000 families who have been forcibly relocated. That's not the way you win a counterinsurgency campaign. But I think the U.S. government would be happy and the military would be happy to provide additional training in those areas. Unfortunately, every time we've offered it, the Egyptians normally say, well, you guys, you failed. You failed in Afghanistan, you failed in Iraq, you have no idea what you're doing. Just give us the weapons and let us do the job our way. And while we understand their frustration and we understand that we're not perfect, we made mistakes, we wish they would make use of our mistakes and incorporate them into their approach moving forward. But until they're willing to accept that type of training, to have a dialogue on how they approach these threats, unfortunately, I don't think they're going to achieve sustainable success against these militants.
And so just to follow up, given the focus on military strikes as the response, the sole response, are there efforts to address the drivers of the extremism, of the ideology in Sinai?
We try to have those conversations with Egyptian officials, and
Right.
Mr. Tadros was talking about the need to have these conversations. In my experience, not just in the Obama administration, but in the first months of the Trump administration, the Egyptians wanted to treat the relationship like a Chinese menu. They wanted to discuss what was important to them, and they wanted to ignore what was important to us. And often that meant these types of issues. They ignored the connection between imprisonment, between torture, and radicalization. And they say, we know how to deal with it. I remember being in a meeting with President Sisi where he said there are two ways to deal with terrorists. You either lock them up or you kill them. Obviously, that leaves something to be desired according to modern understandings of how you deal with terrorists and insurgents. And while that may be emotionally appealing at a certain level, it's unlikely to be efficacious. It's unlikely to produce those results. And that's one of the reasons why I think we need to reset the relationship. Under the current construct, we're not able to have the conversations we need with the Egyptians because we're overwhelmingly focused on what equipment they want and on what equipment they're going to receive, rather than having a genuine strategic discussion about our goals and their goals and how we can better work together.
Mr. Tadros or Dr. John, either of you have comments?
I think Egypt has been fighting the group in Sinai, the Islamic State affiliate, for 6 years now. All previous military campaigns, there have been large military campaigns, they've all failed. The Egyptian regime has announced numbers of about 3,000 or more that they killed of these terrorists and arrested another 16,000 of terrorists in Sinai, while all estimates of the actual number of fighters of the Islamic State ranges from 700 to 1,000. So they're obviously not ending the threat there. They're killing and arresting the wrong people and not ending the threat. The last military campaign that has started in February shows much more positive signs of success. For the first time, they focused on the communications of the Islamic State, which has both diminished the ability of them to carry coordinated attacks because they operate more as independent cells that coordinate then in large attacks, but each is focused on its own area of operation, as well as limited their ability to use media and to talk about their operations and build support. I think also a very important development is the fact that this operation comes after the major massacre of more than 300 peaceful Muslims praying in their mosque. The brutality of the Islamic State, the fact that it targeted normal Muslims, not the security forces, not the Christians, but just regular guys, I think has also helped build popular support in Sinai for the military to finally deal with that situation. So while the potential for a return of major attacks by the Islamic State remains, I think we've seen more positive signs in the last couple of months.
Just briefly, Congressman, I want to add that while we will see what the results of the most recent military campaign in the Sinai were, perhaps we will see a diminution of the militancy in the Sinai. It's really too early to say yet, but what really concerns me is what is going on inside of Egyptian prisons. When we see tens of thousands of people, almost all of them young people, the vast majority young men, and we hear about the kinds of conditions, the torture, the brutality, the solitary confinement, the lack of medical treatment, and that they are often exposed in prison to militants from ISIS and other extremist groups who seem to have free rein to talk to people and recruit and so forth. It really makes me worried. I mean, that's another reason to pay a lot of attention to the human rights problems in Egypt. First of all, from the point of view of principle, but also out of concern that this is a radicalization factory, that it will be producing militants, for many years to come, I fear.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher.
Thank you very much. I apologize that I missed most of the hearing today. As usual, you're scheduled for at least 2 or 3 really important things at exactly the same time. Any discussion of Egypt is an important thing. It is vital because if the Egyptian government would happen to come under the domination of a radical Islamicist, the entire Middle East would be destabilized and there would be war. There would be war and millions of people killed. I remember, and I understand when we can look at, with a very, principled look and say, this is the standard we have, even if, no matter what's going on in a country, they can't do this. But I think that when we look at Egypt today, we better calculate what the danger is and not, I remember when the Shah of Iran was overthrown. I remember that. And I remember how we basically threw him under the bus, as they say. And what did we get for that? What did we get for demanding that the Shah restrained himself in these street demonstrations and these organized efforts to get rid of him? Well, what we got was a brutal mullah dictatorship that even today, as we speak, is murdering its own people and trying to suppress those people's aspirations. And let us note for the record, I hope that if anything comes out of this hearing, it's that we support the people of Iran who are trying to overthrow the mullah dictatorship. And with that said, I would hope that if they manage to do that, and they manage to set up an interim government, that we don't all of a sudden start having such a high standard that we're judging them by, that another mullah regime can beat them down and take power. We saw it with Gaddafi. Oh, Gaddafi was a bad guy. And Gaddafi made some deals with us and with the Russians to get rid of his nuclear weapons. He made a deal with us to make sure that the radical Islamic terrorism would not be used as in Libya. And guess what? We decided to go with the pure Democrats. And what do we have now? We have terrorists who are in control of about a third to half of Libya and total chaos. Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. And I don't think it was, I believe that we should have tried to help the people in Iraq at the time, but we ended up sending U.S. soldiers down there. When the United States is trying to make up its mind what to do, we better do it rationally, and we shouldn't be doing it based on an analysis that is not in firm ground of reality. So, with that said, just what you just mentioned about President El-Sisi, who I think is one of the great champions of stability in that part of the world. And without him, I believe that there would be many more people dying. I believe that especially if, as Morsi would have continued the direction he was going, just the same direction Erdogan is going today, I think that leads to death, instability, and leads to far less freedom in the long run. Yes, someone who is a terrorist, it doesn't bother me that he wants to either string them up or whatever he wants to do with them. Quite frankly, it is a good thing when a terrorist is put out of commission, whichever way they figure out how to do that. Now, I realize that I've spoken too long now, but and I should give you all a chance to refute everything I just said, which is fine, which is part of the process here. But let me just say, we better be darn realistic when we're dealing with these challenges, because if we end up with more people dying and more tyranny in the long run because we've held someone up to a standard that is not appropriate for that particular moment, shame on us. And by the way, I'll finish it with saying much of the criticism I've heard of El-Sisi and his regime has been just that. It's been criticism based on a standard that should not be used at this moment. So with that said, go right ahead, and I know you have some disagreement with me, so but go right ahead and do so. Whoever.
Thank you, Congressman Rohrabacher. You know, I have to say, I really share your concerns that if Egypt would come under the domination of a radical Islamist regime or leader, that it would destabilize the entire region. I agree with you entirely. My worry is that the degree of repression under President Sisi could be taking the country in exactly that direction. You know, that there is really, at this point, there are not the normal channels through which, you know, peaceful differences of opinion through formal politics, electoral competition in the parliament, through a free media, through civil society organizations and so forth. Frankly, things that Egypt had to a greater degree under President Mubarak in the past than they have now. These, you know, and even then Egyptians, you know, eventually revolted against Mubarak. That without these outlets, I really fear that that there could be a breakout of violent, radical, you know, opposition to President Sisi, particularly, if he tries to remain in office more or less indefinitely. So, that is my concern. I don't think anyone here is suggesting that the United States should do anything like intervene in Egypt or the way it did in Iraq, or even participate in an intervention the way it did in Libya. But to somehow use what influence we have to try to persuade the Egyptian leadership to open up those channels for the peaceful expression of dissent and for peaceful political competition, so that Egyptians can find their way forward without future destabilization and an increase in violence.
Thank you very much.
Seeing that there's no other members seeking recognition, I thank the witnesses for sharing your expertise and your opinions with us. This committee stands adjourned.